Can we start, right? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our unique session, Activism and AIDS, Protect Civil Society Space to End the Epidemic. My name is Anton Basenko. I'm a country focal point for a PEACH program in Ukraine. Somebody knows me from my work in Alliance for Public Health. Somebody knows me from the representation of the community of people who use drugs, or from Global Fund Advocates Network. Today, my role is to facilitate this unique session. Unique, why? Because it's the last day of the conference, AIDS2020. It's the last GFAN hosting session. We have unique list of speakers from civil society and communities from different regions of the world, from Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Global Fund. And it's a unique opportunity to raise some critical issues or discussions around AIDS or COVID-19 and the role of civil society in both of these epidemics. The odds are stacked against civil society. Shrinking space and unfriendly, often hostile environments prevent civil society organizations from fulfilling their critical role in ending AIDS. Organizations are being vilified publicly and online, their activities disrupted, and their employees attacked. Now, with COVID-19, their task becomes increasingly tough and relentless. This session presents new research from Civicus, Frontline AIDS, and AIDS funds under the Partnership to Inspire, Transform, and Connect HIV Response, which is PEACH, that reveals how LGBTIQ+ people, sex workers, and people who use drugs face severe restrictions on their right to association, their right to peaceful assembly, their right to freedom of expression, both locally and internationally. In the next hour and a half, we will discuss how these restrictions undermine and dilute the efforts of communities to carry out their work on HIV and AIDS, and further jeopardize the achievements of the UNAIDS 1990 targets. And as we recently know from UNAIDS Weekly Digest, there is a huge risk of reaching these global targets, whether it's 2020 or 2030 targets, by the reason of unexpected COVID-19 epidemics. Civil society representatives situated at the heart of the HIV response will share key outcomes of the report and how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting even more their space to advocate and hold government to account. Representatives from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Global Fund will reflect on recommendations of the report and share their strategies for creating space and enabling marginalized and criminalized groups to actively and fully contribute to an effective HIV and AIDS response and fight COVID-19 together. In light of the ongoing COVID-19 epidemic, this will also be a good opportunity for us to reflect on the lessons learned from HIV and AIDS responses, which would be valuable in the fight against COVID-19 and vice versa. That civil society is helping the most vulnerable, and that is vital that communities are at the heart of the response. I'd like to remind to all of you that during the session, you can post your questions in the chat directed at a speaker. We will answer them during the call or take them forward to the discussion or Q&A session towards the end of the call. And I'd like to invite our next speaker, brilliant Richard Luzimba from the Pan-Africa ILGA, who will share the story of the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on civil society space. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anton, and everyone who's made it for the call. I'm delighted to be joining everyone to speak on this very wonderful and special subject. Just as introduced by Anton, I work with Pan-African ILGA, an LGBTI umbrella organization in Africa, but also a chapter of ILGA World. But formerly, I've been working in Uganda with Sexual Minorities Uganda, and also leading a lot on the public health work around key populations in the country. So I am really delighted to be joining and having this conversation with you. Just as Antoine had said, just like in every other country, COVID-19 has been a great challenge in a way that communities, especially key populations or LGBTI people, have been affected greatly alongside other populations. But one thing we have learned from this crisis of COVID in Uganda has been that as LGBTI people, we've remained vulnerable just as it was before. And it has also showed us that people always take an advantage of a crisis to ensure that they promote their homophobia, but also inflict pain against the LGBTI people. Just as the country was getting to the understanding and also getting into the total lockdown and trying to put measures of COVID-19 to ensure that the populations are protected, we as the LGBTI community in Uganda woke to another reality. This time around, it was a reality of having the LGBTI shelter raided by police, the local defense unit, and also the local leaders. This was a shelter that was housing LGBTI people who were homeless, who had nowhere to go and depended on this shelter. But also it was a space whereby they felt free and protected. But unfortunately, on the 29th of March, that was no more. Over 23 people arrested on that day. They were beaten, pushed, and also forced by the local mayor of the area to declare, to say that they are gay, because that's what he wanted to hear from them. But fortunately, they refused to agree to anything. They went around the building searching, and when they got access to lubricant and condom, quickly they were able to say, yeah, now this clearly shows that they're homosexuals. In that dehumanizing way and moment, the 23 were taken to a police station after having been beaten, and they were claiming that why they had raided the police is because, one, they were trying to respond to the community call that there were people who were practicing illegal things in that building. Now, that was the first statement. So that was a Sunday, and the 23 were taken into custody. So we woke up to a Monday, and the 23 were still in custody. We engaged the police with the lawyers, and they said we're going to release them. And they even talked about it on the press statement, which they addressed the media, and the police said that we're going to release them. We have found out that they have nothing illegal and they have not broken any law. Later on in the afternoon, we got to hear that they are not going to be released anymore because they're going to be charged with having broken the presidential directives of putting people at risk to spread COVID. Now, that was a very big twist, having 23 people in custody. The following day, we woke up to the news. The president had announced that we're going to go into a lockdown. So that meant that we had no access to the 23 who were arrested. There was no car because cars were banned. No one was traveling. Everyone was directed to stay home. On that fateful day, 3 people were released, and 20, unfortunately, were taken to court quickly and sentenced to jail. And they were taken to jail to be brought back after 1 month. Unfortunately, even when that month reached, we're still under total lockdown. This was a moment whereby we could not have access to them because we could not have, we had no transport because all cars were banned. They were taken to jail and they had no legal access to any lawyer or anybody. This was a very tough situation for us as activists, but also as a community. Once again, COVID had shown that we are being targeted and people were taking advantage of the restrictions and the directives that had been put in place by the president to go ahead and implement the homophobic agenda. These young people spent over 50 days in custody. They had no access to a lawyer. They had no access to their meds. We had people who needed to have access to their art. They did not have access to art. We even had one person who was actually on second line, but they could not even have access to this. And this was all happening in the name of protecting the country, but all we knew this was because of homophobia and people's prejudices on the LGBTI community in the country. And this is something that we have seen over and over, that any time anything happens is people are trying to always create an excuse, to the level that they were saying that we are having the COVID crisis because of the LGBTI people and God is trying to punish us. So again, those are kind of things that have been put in society and in the minds of people. And when we were able to secure their release, it was very heartbreaking to realize the torture that had undergone through in jail. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were forced to do all the dehumanizing things. And a lot really showed how much the system is always pointing out to the vulnerable. And again, this reminds us all that as we are vulnerable, we must remember those who are vulnerable amidst us, but also ensure that as we're fighting a pandemic, just like COVID, it should not warrant for the suspension of humanity, but also the suspension of rights. All citizens require to be protected, require to be respected, require to be treated with dignity, regardless of how we are responding or whatever we're responding to. But what also had shown that if a government institutes guidelines or lockdown measures without looking and evaluating access of services, but also the rights of people, it leads. This ensures the abuse. And that's why we also had a crisis whereby people are not able to have access to PrEP or have access to their art. And this is because there was suspension of movement and there were community activities also suspended. And also civil society was not put as a priority or an essential service. So that means that we had no movement and we have no access. Unfortunately, a country like Uganda, civil society is providing a lot of essential services, and especially among the key populations where government has most likely handed over to the global partners or civil society. So again, all this leaves the community vulnerable, and this is something that we learned the hard way as a community, that we found ourselves in a moment whereby we could not even protect our very own, even when we had all the tools that we could. And I think this is something that we have to learn on. But unfortunately, even what we've learned from HIV, that discrimination should be something of the past. Unfortunately, even during COVID, we see this coming back. And it's very, very unfortunate. Thank you very much. Back to you, Anthony.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Richard. It's really good that we as a communities have at least an opportunity to help to our brothers and sisters in such kind of situations. And of course, we all observe this reality of COVID-19, but talking about the traditionally or historically criminalized, marginalized, stigmatized and discriminated communities, I see from your example that everything is just sharpened, double, triple sharpened within the COVID-19 reality. So next speaker, I'm inviting Sylvia, who will present the research on the restrictions of civil society, civic freedoms. But before Sylvia speak, let's view the introduction video to the report. So I'm inviting Celia from Civicus, one of the leading organizations prepared this report within the pitch research. Celia, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes, and please, I'm asking you and all next speakers to keep strictly in time. And for the listeners, don't forget to turn off your mics.
Thank you very much, Anton. I'll try my best to speak, to keep to my 10 minutes. I'm going to present the findings of the research, which we undertook together with AIDS funds and Frontline AIDS for the past year or so, in collaboration with partners from 4 countries that we shall mention as we proceed with the discussion. So basically, the research was intended to try and examine the dynamics around the civil society globally and nationally, and then to understand the impact of these developments on HIV and AIDS response. And then lastly, also to propose recommendations to act as an influencers on broadening of civil society space. So this was basically in recognition of the fact that over the last few decades, HIV and AIDS response has been actually successful and has achieved a lot because of the role that civil society has played in ensuring that milestones are met and achievements are made. In fact, civil society in this area has been an unparalleled example of engagement and leadership. It has been crucial in advocating for sustainable financial resources, improving HIV and AIDS programming, and advancing human rights in general. And we have seen civil society be very key and instrumental in raising awareness of the rights of marginalized groups such as key populations, and empowering them and giving them a voice. And in fact, right now, as we go through the whole COVID-19 pandemic, it has been no different. We're seeing that from Vietnam to Zimbabwe, civil society has mobilized to provide vulnerable communities with basic medical services and also basic needs such as food and shelter. And so we see the key role and the importance of civil society in these issues of pandemics and global emergencies where human rights are at risk. And in fact, we have seen states over the last few decades acknowledging the very important role of civil society. From the year 2000, where we had MDGs putting a specific goal on HIV, TB, and malaria, where civil society was very instrumental in having this key goal targeting specifically these diseases. And then to 2001, where we had the UN General Assembly putting AIDS on high political agenda, and in fact recognizing the key role of civil society. However, even on the other hand, despite these political commitments, what we have been seeing over the last few years again is that civil society space is actually closing. And in fact, according to a report released by Civicus in November 2019 titled People Power Under Attack, we see that only 3% of the world's population is living in countries with open civic space. What does this mean? This means that civil society is under threat, despite the commitments that states are making, despite the very important role that we have seen civil society playing in times of emergencies. Civil society space is shrinking. So basically, this report intends to highlight the widening gap between these commitments and to show what actually is happening with civil society in terms of them trying to play their role. And actually, especially for marginalized communities, such as people who use drugs, the LGBTIQ+ community, sex workers, the research basically tries to show their experiences and tries to balance this out with the commitments that states are making with what we are seeing actually on the ground. So we did this research in 2 levels. So the first level we did national. We tried to have national level research where we picked 4 very diverse and very different countries and tried to do a research to see what civil society in those countries is going through. And then we did also international level, which we shall discuss later on. So at the national level, we had Zimbabwe, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And in all these 4 countries, we tried to see what kind of civic space restrictions that civil society are facing as they try to advance the rights of key populations to end HIV and AIDS. So in all the countries, we see violations across the three key civic space rights, that is the freedom of association, the right to peaceful assembly, and the right to freedom of expression. Most of them are similar, but they vary in terms of severity and frequency. So one of the key things that we see, across all the 4 countries is the legal context. In all the 4 countries, we have criminalization of key populations. So whether it is sex work, whether it is people who use drugs, whether it is LGBTQ+ communities, we see across the 4 countries a common theme of criminalizing either some or more or all of the key population groups. When it comes to perpetrators, again, broadly overlap across the 4 countries. We see that law enforcement are the key perpetrators in terms of state actors. And we also see non-state actors such as religious groups and members of the public also coming up and getting mentioned as key violators as well. In terms of driving forces across the 4 countries, we see 2 main driving forces standing out in terms of violations of civic space. This is traditional values and religious intolerance. So a lot of what interviewers were saying is that a lot of these violations are driven by these traditional values and religious intolerance, which translate into the stigma and discrimination and eventually lead to the violations. Except a country like Ukraine, where we had a slightly different dynamic, where we see right-wing political values also being an additional driving force in the country. So in terms of cross-cutting trends, again, across the 4 countries, we see 3 main cross-cutting trends coming up. We see criminalization of key populations only in varying degrees, and then we see the targeting of the LGBTQI+ community. Lastly, we see law enforcement getting mentioned over and over again across the 4 countries as the most notable violators of civic space of key population groups. So the next, we had the international level findings, where we tried to analyze formal or informal closing of civic space for individuals and organizations attempting to influence processes at international and regional fora. So for example, the UN mechanisms, the African Union, African Commission on Human Rights, those kind of forums. So we try to analyze in the report again, trends related to accreditation, where we actually mentioned specific instances where we had key populations blatantly being denied accreditation to participate in key meetings that were speaking about issues that affect them. And then we also look at other things like speaking opportunities, the influence of anti-rights groups, bureaucracy in participating, and stigma and discrimination by states and other CSOs, and these kind of things. And then we also look at internal barriers which prevent key populations and their civil society organizations. Lastly, we look at things like lack of technical capacity and lack of financial time and resources. So what is the impact of civic space restrictions on the global HIV response? We note three key issues that come up in terms of impact. Number one, we have seen key population organizations actually closing down their offices due to repeated attacks. We mentioned examples, for example, in Ukraine, and we also mentioned other examples in the report. Okay. So we see criminalization has led to secrecy within some of these key population groups, which complicates the collection of data, which is essential for the for development of effective and targeted programs for these groups. And then lastly, at the international and regional levels, the restrictions and challenges have led to inadequate participation of key populations in these processes that actually affect them. And this has led to outcome documents that fail to address issues that affect them. We also again give specific examples of UN meetings where the lack of accreditation led to key populations not being involved in processes that are affecting them. And then later on, they came out and said that these documents did not really meaningfully address issues that affect them. So as we battle the COVID-19 pandemic, we see similarities between HIV and COVID in terms of marginalized groups and the role of civil society, and also the targeting of marginalized groups. So in the same way that we are seeing certain communities getting persecuted within the HIV response, the same can be said with COVID. As Richard mentioned, the cases in Uganda, in terms of targeting of the LGBTQIA+ communities. We also see the same in some of these other countries that were in our case study. For example, in Ukraine, where the report identifies religious figures as notable perpetrators, we see again in April this year, where one of the country's LGBTIQ+ groups announced that they were going to sue an eminent religious figure for remarks blaming COVID-19 on same-sex marriage. And then again in Vietnam, where the report notes that CSOs have been subjected to unexpected police visits and fear publicly opposing the policies and actions of state actors. We see that during the COVID-19 pandemic, again, hundreds who have tried to share timely information about coronavirus have been summoned to police stations for interrogation, with some even getting fined. So lastly, what lessons can be learned from HIV/AIDS response as we battle COVID-19? One, in terms of natural disasters and health emergencies, as we have seen with HIV and AIDS, we see that it is civil society who's on the front lines, and their mobilization has made tremendous difference in reaching the most vulnerable groups. Secondly, there is need for greater community participation and sustainability, for sustainability and scalability. It is important, therefore, that governments include civil society in their long-term containment and treatment plans. So therefore, we see that from HIV and to coronavirus, it is vital that communities are at the heart of the response. And lastly, in these times of COVID-19, there is need for civil society to closely monitor the restrictions being imposed by governments on civic freedoms. We see that many countries have invoked state of emergencies and emergency laws, and we need to, as civil societies, monitor these restrictions on freedoms, particularly on marginalized groups. So the work of NGOs and community groups has become even more challenging in this new environment, and if unduly imposed or abused, these restrictions may have the potential to undo all these decades of civil society achievement to end AIDS, and we cannot let that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. You see some surprises happening during your session, but I think the problem is resolved now. You see, we have 2 popular sessions, so everybody wants to come in. Thanks for this important presentation. I am really proud that Ukraine was one of the countries part of this research, and actually I was proud to assist on the national level to provide the collection of these critical data. But of course, I'm really upset from the factual situation we have, which is well illustrated in this report. So now we are coming to the part to give you more broader understanding of the problems with particular civic freedoms, using particular country examples from different communities. Today I'm not only facilitator, but also one of the speaker, and I'm moving to the small presentation, or rather the reality and the speech about the reality with freedom of peaceful assembly in countries of the report, and especially in Ukraine. Could you please bring the slide with the thanks. So as you can see briefly, partially Sylvia has already mentioned some of these things. Talking about the freedom of peaceful assembly, it could be absolutely different restrictions or risks, or different problems like forced dispersion and attacks by counter-protesters in Indonesia, like restrictive and punitive laws, break up of peaceful gatherings, hunting down of key populations in Zimbabwe, unexpected visits by police, restrictions on authorization, harassment, excessive force and detention in Vietnam. And finally, in my country, it's attacks on protests, demonstrations, and marches, or even physical abuse of LGBTQI community. You know, being a many years activist and advocate in the community of people who use drugs, Of course, I do know how important is to have this freedom of peaceful assembly, because when it's talking to our advocacy, or when we would like to raise some critical issues, to call for action, or to disagree with some policy of the government, especially drug policy in my case, we always using the street as the platform for assembly and openly speaking. But talking about the different actions, whether it's people who use drugs community, or sex workers march, or LGBT prides, unfortunately, we are always facing with particular attacks. It could be really different in different ways. Unfortunately, it's much more sharpened since 2016, 2017, after the last revolution in Ukraine, when a lot of far-right political movements or religious movements really activated and trying to counterpart or to push their opposition to the our kind of calls for democratic freedoms, for the drug policies, adequate drug policies, or for decriminalization. Unfortunately, some of the examples of the attacks on this peaceful assembly were the disruption of rally of transgender people by ultra-right groups in Kiev in November 2018, or we had an incident in 2018 where the organizer of LGBTQ march in Kryvyi Rih, in one of the Ukrainian cities, was beaten twice. We always observe these cases of fights or attacks, physical abuse of the people who join in the LGBT pride, which is no longer, which is now promoting broadly than just LGBT. It's a kind of human rights pride for the equal rights, but still people who promoting kind of traditional family values in Ukraine, they unfortunately considering this as an attack on their traditional paradigm thinking or their freedoms. Actually, I don't know how, but still. And they are always coming to the pride and attacking people. The same when it's coming to the, for example, Support Don't Punish campaign, Global Day of Action for people who use drugs on 26th of June. Some years ago, we were really overlapped with the opposition side, the religion-based groups, including former drug users, by the way. But I don't know, the people has another philosophy, and they think that it's okay if they are attacking us, if they are kind of prohibiting us to speak openly, frankly on the streets. The same things we are observing when it's coming to the sex workers marches, when where the main message is decriminalization of sex work, and of course there are raised oppositions and from other parts of people who are not just trying to be in the discussion or kind of you know, proper relationship with these street actions, but they are just aggressively attacking, they are beating and stuff. So in 2018, the equality marches passed off peacefully in Kyiv, Odessa, and Kryvyi Rih, only thanks to significant measures taken by police to prevent the attacks. So the number of police, which is now invited or provided by the Ministry of Interior to keep safety on these actions is much more than the number of people, sometimes the participants of the action. That's briefly the reality of the peaceful assembly in Ukraine. And of course, talking about the COVID-19 reality, as I mentioned, as people who use drugs, we immediately faced with a huge list of different limitations like transportation, access to public transport, access to treatment, other limitations which keeps you off the life-saving treatment, whether it's ARV or substitution therapy, or providing the barriers of access to services. So it's, unfortunately, it's just sharpening, and now we are observing the second wave of COVID pandemic in Ukraine. So I have really bad kind of really fears about the future. So I'm inviting our next speaker, Baby Rivona from Indonesia, to reflect on the freedom of association. Baby, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening from Indonesia. Thank you all to having me here to sharing my experience and related to the Civicus report like Sylvia mentioned. My name is Baby Rivona. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a national coordinator of women living with HIV and also PITS country focal point. So thank you, Anton, to remind me about the protect civil society space to end the epidemic. I have 2 points I want to stress in before I come to the freedom of association. My experience and mostly our experience in Indonesia during the daily basis advocacy, the invitation from CSO sent to the authorities are often ignored and rarely being attended by the official to discuss the future of HIV advocacy in Indonesia. And then the second thing, 2 months ago when I was attending virtual the fora, the United Nations on SDGs in Asia Pacific, for HIV issues we only had chance in the last minute intervention after several attempts to speak out were denied by the chair. This reminds me how the space for civil society is more, even if you mention about no one left behind, we already left behind at the moment. So coming to the freedom of association, we have 4 country research from the Civicus. Mostly from the 4 country is refuse or restriction about the registration of organization, and also office raid and raids activity for the key population. So for the Zimbabwe refused the registration for the civil society organization. Coming to the Indonesian, like for example that in Indonesia, key population classified as people with social dysfunction under the regulation that was written by the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. It's obvious that we are already in the box of exclusion. So another example is the government campaign that in the social media had speech about the LGBT issues. So this influence a lot of people in Indonesia to make another stigma or criminalize the community, especially from LGBT community and also the sex worker community, drug user, all key population. So mostly in the 4 country, we have the same problem that about the freedom of association. So, and also one example from Indonesia, when we have a protest on the penal code, our partner office is uninvited coming by the police and want to check the urine test, what the related the protest with the urine test. We going protest on the street for the bill of penal code, criminal law, and then they come into the office for the urine test because we're working for the drug user population. So this kind of example that freedom of association happening in Indonesia. So in terms of the related, what we're facing at the moment about the COVID-19 impact of the freedom in Indonesia, this become worse for people living with HIV. I have 2 points I want to stressing in this COVID-19 situation. The first is physical distancing and accused to skip civil society consultation. For example, how we can monitor the bill of penal code is difficult to monitor the progress because we are locked down until now, and at the parliament also still no people. So we are afraid that the article back, like the ancient article 100 years ago, or they just suddenly silent past the law, we don't know. And also the second thing about the consultation is the law of elimination of sexual violence. It should become a priority at the parliament to pass the bill this year, and then they just push to the next year and not become the priority anymore. So this our concern about in terms of the COVID-19 situation. And the second thing is about our life. There is the direct impact of our life as the people living with HIV. Lockdown denied people living with HIV to access their treatment. So this is experience in Indonesia since the end of last year. We already counting that we coming to stock out the ARV, and also we start campaign early 2020. From February, we start to campaign, massive campaign all over Indonesia from the social media, and also we speak to the media. And on March, we already are locked down, and then we already stock out. So we got panic in this situation, and also we try to get the medication from outside, from the India. We import mostly, but India also locked down. This is make the people living with HIV in Indonesia not get the proper amount of pills. They only get for 5 days, or some of them not even get the regimen. And also some of them is even have to change the regimen they use. So this situation make worse for HIV issues. Now I just thinking, what do we need in this situation? So in my recommendation is donor and philanthropy organizations should not shift the HIV/AIDS funding to COVID-19 emergency fund, because HIV still need, like Anton mentioned earlier, we need access, we need treatment, we need the services still open, still available for us. We need the stock of medication safe for our life. And also for Indonesia, the punitive and discriminative law are increased. We need our international allies to strategize at the sub-regional, regional, and the global level. While at the national level, we keep trying to lobby it for laws and regulation revision that can be pro to key population. And the last thing is We are so disappointed that regardless of which platform we use, civil society voices are being pushed at the end of the line, at the time when we should be listened to the first. How we can changing the situation if our own government or member state doesn't want to listen from us, who end beneficiary for the all program in our country. As a civil society organization should speak out and be visible more during international fora, and the national fora are not accessible for us. So this is from me, Anton. I give back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, dear baby. Oh, we see our interested friends, hackers on the screen. I guess the hosts can deal with this. So as you see, as we understand, Ukraine, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe, it's just 4 selected country for this research, but we all understand that the problems and the restrictions communities facing with all these problems around the world in different countries. That is why I invited again Richard Lusimbo to reflect on the freedom of expression and how this applies to Uganda and also specifically during COVID-19 time. Richard, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Anton. And it's unfortunately when I'm going to be speaking about freedom of expression, there's some people who feel that expressing their racism in a space whereby we should be speaking about protecting each other is really unfortunate. But looking at the report, there are very key things that are really common among the 4 countries in Ukraine, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, and Vietnam. One of the key things that really came out strongly in the report is that of attacks online, and whereby the communities of key populations have been censored, but also there's been a lot of verbal abuses online. And this is something that has cut across the different countries. And I must also say, this is something that continues to be reflected across the different countries, and also which also brings into Uganda. One of the things that we have seen as we work and also continue doing the work is that when communities are organizing, they have always had or they've been able to link their work through online platforms, things like social media, websites, and blogs, because access to the mainstream media continues to remain a big challenge, whereby there's a lot of censorship within the mainstream media, whereby, for example, in Uganda, most of the times media, when reporting about issues of key populations or LGBTI, they'll specifically report it when in a negative way, not in a dignifying way. And we find that most of the times that is what is always carried around, or media sometimes gives a blackout whereby they don't talk about these issues. So we find that the community is always relying online. But as you can see from the report, there continuously are attacks on these spaces, politicizing the bodies and issues of key populations and LGBTI people, which has greatly affected people, which pushes people back into the closet, but also which pushes people in a way not to be able to express themselves freely, but also to be able to access services, because they are scared that if they spoke their truth of who they are, then that would be a hindrance in terms of accessing HIV services, but also any other health services. So again, this remains a very, very big concern. And unfortunately, it cuts across various countries. So it's not just particular to one country like Uganda or others that are appearing in the report, but this is a true reflection and true reality of what's happening to key populations and LGBTI community members across the country. I also want to particularly use a few more remaining minutes of my time to speak about how also COVID has affected the issue around sex workers in Uganda, particularly where we saw in April, we had over 117 sex workers who were rounded up across the country. They were beaten, dehumanized, again, just because of who they are. And also and this was released in a statement by the Uganda Key Population Consortium and other partners. And we continuously see that even during these processes, the right to express who we are remains a very, very big concern, which also, again, directly affects our bodily autonomy, but also who we choose, who we are, and also how we express ourselves. And that remains a very huge hindrance. So I really appreciate the fact that this report that's going to be launched today actually helps us to highlight these concerns. And it's a reminder, because these are things that key populations have talked about for a very long time. But I think it's an opportunity for us to discuss with partners and say, okay, enough is enough. We've talked about these issues. What's now the way forward? How do we ensure that the spaces, that the communities are able to express themselves in terms of what their needs are, or what needs to be done, or what developments that is happening in communities are protected? And how do we ensure that those spaces are actually safe, so that communities can truly engage in these spaces? We see the service provision of key populations across the globe, which is always among targeted facilities or hotspots. So how do we ensure that also those spaces are safe and those services are continuous, even in a period like we are in now, which I choose to call the unusual moment, which is the COVID moment. So I think it's very, very important that as we discuss this as a civil society, or partners or governments, it's important and it's incumbent that we provide spaces that where people or key populations and LGBTI are able to express themselves freely without fearing or feeling that they're going to be verbally or emotionally or mentally abused or denied the right to express themselves. Thank you very much, Aton. Over back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. So we heard three country examples, three reflections on different freedoms, and of course we have, the report has the recommendations. It's also three recommendations. I should sound them. States, regional and international bodies and civil society organizations should strengthen collaboration and scale up joint initiatives to ensure and conducive operating environment for civil society, particularly for organizations working with key populations and or on sexual reproductive health and rights. The second recommendation is that states, regional and international bodies and global CSOs should leverage the extensive knowledge and expertise within local civil society and communities for policy formulation and responsive programming grounded in human rights and evidence. And the final recommendation is that states, regional and international bodies should support, including financially, and recognize the benefits of strong civil society and community-based organizations that can effectively advocate for social change and the needs of communities. Now I'd like to invite the representative of Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Asveld, and to ask you, dear Maria, to reflect on how a dialogue and dissent partnership has contributed to protecting civic space, and how are you taking this forward in the new partnerships? Also, as you are board member of UNAIDS and Global Fund, perhaps you could share what opportunities you see in addressing these report recommendations through these two global initiatives. Maria, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anton. Do you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Super. Well, thanks a lot for organizing this session. And I think the importance of the discussion we have today is only shown by what we have seen in the screens happening today. Thank you also for publishing the report. And by reading it, I had the feeling on the one hand, like, oh, this could be a report of 10 years ago. And that's at the same time shocking, because we see progress, but we also see a lot of setbacks. And I think that underlines the importance again to have this discussion today and to continue to fight for the rights of all people who have HIV/AIDS, and not just those diseases, actually to continue fighting for the right for health for all, leaving no one behind, and making sure that all vulnerable groups have access to care. Yeah, so as you know, the Dutch government is very passionate about the importance of the rights-based approach to health and to HIV/AIDS. And we do that as a matter of principle, but also as a matter of practice, because we have seen that it works. I mean, if you just look at the new figures for HIV/AIDS infections, it's the smartest thing to do, to reach out to those groups who are affected mostly. And I think that's also the reason why we continue to support our approach to key POPs and to vulnerable groups. And we have done this by several partnerships in the past, but I also would like to mention first that that's not just the only way to go ahead. We are a government, and we also have our diplomatic ways of working. And I think although you don't see us perhaps very often acting as a diplomat, it is also something that we try to do behind the scenes, sometimes in a silent way. And sometimes we speak out, like our minister spoke out by the opening of the HIV2020 conference. But again, specific approaches do work. We have seen the impact of Bridge. We have seen the impact of Bridging the Gaps and other partnerships that we have been supporting, not just for LGBT, but also for drug users, sex workers, women and girls, the broader HRSR agenda. And that has all convinced us to continue to work this way. So we are very happy that also this month, or last month actually, we were able to award new grants to several partnerships that will continue working in this field. We're proud. On the other hand, we're also sometimes sad to see that the basis, the financial basis for this type of support remains very thin. And so one other thing that we are doing is we try to continue to talk to other donors and make sure that they help us in the support for civil society. We do that to other donors. We also talk to Global Fund. We talk to UNAIDS. Both organizations are at the point of developing a new strategy. So as a board member in the Global Fund and as an active member in the PCB for UNAIDS, again, the Netherlands is striving for specific support and action towards key populations, and also to make sure that the work that is done also is led by the groups. Nothing about us without us. Make sure that civil society organizations are in the lead of activities and that they are supported to do that. We have not talked much about COVID today, although at the beginning of this session, we heard the terrible examples how COVID is often misused to further limit the rights of the people that we are talking about today. Some terrible examples have passed this afternoon. But I also would like to perhaps try and give a bit of a positive note to it, because what I have seen recently is that COVID also creates a lot of opportunities for civil society. And I think, for instance, the way the civil society is now working together with WHO and other partners on the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator is, to my opinion, rather unprecedented. And I think it also shows that civil society engagement and activism comes in many colors. It's not just, you know, protests on the street or influencing parliamentarians. It's also working with the UN system to make sure that their response is sensitive to all the groups that are in need for support. And I think what we have seen now with COVID, and the other thing which I think is positive, is that in the Global Action Plan for Healthy Lives and Wellbeing that was published last year by the UN, there is also, one of the pillars is civil society engagement. And we have to make sure that we galvanize these strong recommendations and that we make sure that civil society is equipped, is put in the position to take this role. And yeah, that is another reason why we think it's really important to strengthen civil society, because they do matter and it has a major impact. Yeah, I think those are the points that I would like to make, actually. Again, I think for COVID, we have to make sure that we pick up on the lessons that we have learned within the HIV response, but that we also try to broaden civil society engagement to not just HIV, but also the other health issues, and that we should really try to avoid and fragmentize our efforts. And personally, I don't think it makes sense to have a different activism group for each individual subgroup or individual disease. And I would really like to encourage all the people here in this chat room to make sure that we strengthen our collaboration, and we join our efforts, not just for HIV/AIDS, but also for TB, for malaria, for SRHR, and maybe for universal health coverage in general. I think that in the end will have the biggest impact for all of us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Maria. I really want to, first of all, to thanks for the financial support of Dutch government as well as Global Fund in the COVID time, specifically reprogramming or providing the funding targeting for the COVID-19 issues which key populations are facing with. And I do confirm that Dutch government directly or through the Global Fund many years systematically supports with services like harm reduction, and I'm one of the beneficiaries and I'm really proud of it. And also it's really critical and important to have not only beneficiary and to have funding for services as such or treatment, but to have resources for the advocacy. And in this sense, I would like to remind that being a country focal point of PEACH program, which is part of Dialogue and Dissent, and to my mind, it's a really unique advocacy program, not only within the size of the budget, which was provided specifically, exclusively for the advocacy programs, but because this is a program by key populations, for key populations, and unfortunately, the end is this year, 2020. And using my power as a facilitator, before we start the Q&A session, I would like to ask you one question. You know that Ukraine is one of the PEACH countries and the only one in the Eastern Europe, Central Asia, which was part of the PEACH, additionally to the regional level of PEACH program. We did our best and we have really important achievements, and especially in terms of the advocacy of for key populations and regarding these freedoms we are talking about, and to fight with these restrictions and to to keep standing up for fight. But unfortunately, in the last call for proposal of Dutch government, we realized that Eastern Europe and Ukraine is no longer a priority, a geographical priority for the Dutch government. Could you please comment on the reason and how it's correlate with the all funds which was invested in this region and in my country from the point of sustainability and sustainability, the achievements of this advocacy and of the key populations and our development and capacity building.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your question, Anton. And I think that many of your friends in Ukraine and other Eastern European countries are struggling with the same question. It's a difficult thing. As an organization, a political organization, we are very much under pressure to set priorities. And as you may know, our minister has chosen to focus her efforts in certain regions in the world. And Eastern Europe has not been identified as a priority region for the broader development cooperation agenda, basically. So when we launched our grant scheme, people who applied for the grants were encouraged to focus their applications on the focus areas. We did never exclude Eastern Europe. In fact, applicants could include up to 24% of their activities and budget into non-focus countries. But since the grant is an instrument that allows for competition, most of the applicants have decided not to include Eastern European countries in order to increase their chances of getting the grant. Which was not, they should not have done this. Again, they could include up to 24% of their budget expenditures outside the focus regions, but still they have decided not to include these countries. So that is really the part that was out of our hands. We also regret that in the proposals that have been selected, no Eastern European countries were included. On the other hand, we also understand that some programs need to focus. It's quite difficult to have an effective program that is spread out all over the world. So even from the perspective of the people who handed in proposals, I can imagine that they prefer to focus in certain regions. But that said, we also need to see what this means for our efforts in Eastern Europe. And perhaps we can still continue to work through our embassies or through our multilateral approach. And we will try and find ways to continue our support to key populations in Eastern Europe one way or another. We will not be able to fund a separate additional project because that's all part of an open contesting mechanism, but we will find other ways to continue our support, whether it's financially or diplomatically.
Thanks, Maria, for this comprehensive reply. I do hope that maybe Netherlands Embassy in Ukraine could be one of the additional sources, or in countries, I mean, Ukraine as an example, could be one of the sources for further support through the other initiatives, perhaps. Thank you. And we can invite our next speaker, my good friend, Kate Thompson from Global Fund. Kate, I'm welcoming you, and could you please introduce yourself and reflect on the Community Rights and Gender Strategic Initiative of the Global Fund, which is addressing many of the issues discussed here today. Perhaps we can discuss some achievements up to date and how we can expect the Global Fund to scale up its work in expanding the space for key population in the context of the new strategy, by the way. Kate?
Thanks, Anton. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sure.
Fantastic. So first of all, I just wanted to congratulate everyone on this really impressive but very sobering report. And it's great to be a part of this session where it's being discussed in more detail. The voice and advocacy of communities and civil society was critical in the establishment of the Global Fund, and it remains key in every aspect of the way we operate. So the GFAN principles are really at our core, not only about engagement of people living with HIV, but also key populations who often bear the brunt not only of HIV, but who are often excluded from services and policy development and decision making, and whose voices are so often silenced or repressed, which is something we've heard very clearly in this report as well. So you asked, Antoine, about the CRG strategic initiative, which is managed by the CRG department at the Global Fund. It's coming to the end of its second 3-year cycle. And for each of these cycles, we've had around $15 million to support it. And its aim is really about ensuring the meaningful engagement of communities in Global Fund-related processes. It's organized in 3 components, which I'll describe briefly right now. So component 1 is about short-term technical assistance that's provided, is peer-led, and where possible, South-based TA, to ensure that communities are meaningfully engaged in Global Fund-related processes in countries across the grant life cycle. And so this can include things like providing safe spaces for key population groups, for young women's groups, but whoever, to really build their own advocacy messages and prepare to engage in the broader processes of funding request development and implementation. So it's used in very many different ways by different groups, and it can be requested from any groups on the ground. So for this 3-year cycle, as of April this year, we'd provided, I think, 111 TA assignments across around 69 countries, including in a number, I think it's 17 challenging operating environments. The second component of the strategic initiative is really about longer term capacity building. And this is funding that goes through global key populations, as well as global key population networks, as well as networks of people affected by TB and malaria civil society networks. And it's really about supporting them to develop capacity that ensures communities are engaging safely and effectively, and advocating for increased investments and more rights-based and gender-responsive programs. And they're also, some of this funding is used to adapt and use evidence-based implementation tools and guidance. So the HIV grantees are, the main key HIV key population networks, and then we have, as I mentioned, a number of TB networks and some newer malaria partners, such as Civil Society for Malaria Elimination. In addition, in this last cycle, the Her Voice Fund was created to support the meaningful engagement of adolescent girls and young women, specifically in 13 African countries. And through that, there are around 183 sub-grants awarded to about 170 organizations. And these grants have been really used to support participation, community consultation, policy and advocacy, and community and communications and outreach. And we're really delighted now that the hosting of Her Voice has been taken over by Y+, and with some tremendous support from Viv, as well as a new partner. And then the third component is the 6 regional platforms, civil society hosted, for strengthening communication and coordination systems, to really try and ensure that communities are able to utilize quality information and communication and about participating in decision-making processes, and also access coordinated TA and support. I think in this last period, the platforms have been reaching around 32,500 constituents and done a lot of work on TA and targeted activities on the ground. We've just received the external evaluation of the CRGSI, and we're going to be refining its approach for the next 3 years to better ensure that the TA is really meeting the needs of key populations and others most affected by TB and malaria. I wanted to also briefly mention, because it relates to a lot of what's been discussed in the report, is the Global Fund's Breaking Down Barriers initiative, because it's also playing an important role in addressing some of the issues raised within the report. things like addressing damaging laws and policies and supporting legal and human rights literacy and documentation of abuses. And the initiative is really aiming to increase the effectiveness of our grants by moving towards comprehensive programming to reduce human rights related barriers to health services. And it started in 20 countries. In fact, Indonesia and Ukraine and Uganda are part of the cohort, so I think there's some expertise on this panel that goes beyond what I can say about them. But there really is, behind it is the idea that if we address some of the human rights and gender-related barriers to health services, we'll see increased access and ultimately greater impact of the grants. And I think we've had a number of baseline assessments done in multi-stakeholder meetings. And then countries are moving forward with multi-year plans. And the programming includes basically the 7 key programs that are outlined by UNAIDS, including addressing stigma and discrimination, sensitization of healthcare workers on medical ethics and human rights, training of law enforcement officials, legal literacy, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that really, I think, will, aims to impact on some of the key messages that came out in the report. So moving forward, in terms of what we're planning to do in the next period in terms of supporting engagement, I think, as I mentioned, through the new CRG strategic initiative, we hope to continue to provide support for engagement and improve that support. Also through, I think, as I mentioned, the Breaking Down Barriers initiative, we're really trying to extend the scale up of programs that address human rights related barriers in more countries. And I mean, just on COVID, again, we're clear that we have to protect and promote community and civil society engagement and protect human rights within the context of COVID. We've heard we've heard in this session about how COVID is being used in some contexts to really instrumentalize further discrimination. It's being used as an excuse really to roll back some of the important gains in terms of human rights and for women and for key populations. So we've produced a number of guidance on human rights in the context of COVID, on gender and community-led responses, and we're monitoring that closely within the context of the fund. I think also just a few other points in the funding cycle, where we will have a specific, much more of a focus on supporting community-led monitoring via our grants, which is supported by a new strategic initiative, and also more of a focus on community-led responses more broadly for the 3 diseases and for COVID. And we're working very closely with the ACT Accelerator partners to really ensure, and many of you actually on this call, to ensure the meaningful engagement of communities and civil society within that context. And then just like I couldn't end without talking about the new strategy. So please do check online on the Global Fund website for information on how to make your voices heard, and expect to hear more in the coming months. I think we're all deeply challenged about the need how to do things virtually in a way that will ensure meaningful engagement and robust engagement of communities and civil society, as well as human rights advocates and gender advocates, in what are going to be really important discussions, because your voices matter. The Global Fund is doing a lot, but we could be doing much more and much better, and we need to really ensure that that's instilled in the new strategy development. And lastly, just to say that partnership is going to underpin all of this, and it's really about partnership with civil society, communities, key populations, including sex workers, men who are sex with men, trans communities, people who use drugs, as well as young people, women and girls in all their diversity, and also with bilateral and multilateral partners, and all of the allies that who are out there who do believe in free speech and in empowerment and in human rights and gender equality. And those of us who believe in the importance of striving towards a stronger and vibrant civil society in all countries. And there's a lot of challenges there, but we have to keep pushing. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. So Kate is our last speaker, and now we are coming to the Q&A session. I reminding you that we used a chat to collect some number of questions already, and it's already it's still open for the additional questions or comments, because we also kind of opened the discussion, but we are really limited in time. So I would like to raise one question to Richard, to Anton, to myself, starting from this question, because the question sounds like it's evidence that civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and many other rights and freedoms of KPs served by various KP-led organizations are infringed. How do we protect and promote the rights of individuals and equally the autonomy of CSOs that are or not registered legally? Actually, it's an interesting question, because talking about my country, we are lucky to have a legal opportunity to register the community-based organizations with wording, with using the wording, the people who use drugs, for example. But again, many years we are dealing with just initiative groups, and I don't think that this is some kind of condition which gives you exclusive opportunity to promote your rights just to be legally registered, because thanks to the donors, thanks to the organizations who many years supporting the community of people who use drugs, as of today, we have quite good network, global network of not only legally registered global, regional, national networks, but also well-linked initiative groups to the national leaders, etc. But another thing is just to use your personal capacity as advocates to try and to join some advisory bodies of the government or of the facilities. So I think that's the answer. Also, we have a question to Richard, but I think, Richard, are you with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Good. Richard, the question to you is, we all are aware that sex workers are more vulnerable to both COVID-19 and HIV infection due to the nature of our work. Based on the thematic area of how CSOs will survive to curb the epidemic, however, how best can we strengthen CSOs in their respective countries to integrate HIV interventions with COVID-19, more specifically with sexual reproductive health and rights, as it is pertinent to address SRHR issues given the situation?
Thank you very much, Anton, for reading out that question. And quickly, I just want to say that it's important that we as a community start also making some adjustments in terms of how we do our programming. And one of the things that I have seen that sex workers have been doing in Uganda is moving to the social networking services, whereby peers look out or create a cell in order to provide services to their peers. The other thing has been working closely with service providers who have access to movement in terms of vehicles, to really move the services closer, but also with the support of peers from the sex work movement. So those have been one of the ways that we've been able to work quickly. But also the other thing is we worked with different civil society organizations, and we wrote an open letter to the president, clearly showing how the different measures that had been put in place by government were hindering access to HIV services, specifically for people living with HIV and people also we did reach out to the Minister and the PS of Minister of Health, who immediately responded to this call. So again, it is not an issue of only working with one given partner or one solution, but I think it's also really finding ways of ensuring that you collaborate and bring things together at different angles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. We also have a question to Kate. What are the best strategies that civil society and communities can use to address these challenges? I mean, the challenges raised during this session. Should we be focusing on the removal of harmful and discriminatory laws by working directly with legislators? And the courts, or should we focus at the community level to remove stigma and shift social norms? Kate?
Thanks for the question. I actually think we have to have a multi-pronged approach. There's no point in doing one and not the other. We have to be working at all these different levels. It's like there's no one magic bullet for this. So I think it's important to be working on some of the longer term change in laws and policies, which may take longer, and at the same time working at the community level. Actually, I say this, but I think addressing stigma and discrimination can actually take as long sometimes as changing laws and policies, unfortunately, and that's the reality. But we have to work at all those multi-levels and just keep chipping away, and then hopefully we finally get gains. The problem is, I think what we've seen in this report is you get gains and then things roll back as well. There's, so it's ongoing work. I just wanted to add something. There was a question around whether the Global Fund has a rights-based approach. I can't remember the actual language. And just to flag that, we have 4 strategic priorities in our strategy, and one of the 4 is promoting and protecting human rights and gender equality. So it is one of our 4 pillars in the strategy, and I'm confident that moving forward in the next strategy, human rights will be central as well. But we will be relying on all of the communities here today and others to help make sure that what's behind that is really firm and implementable as well. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Unfortunately, we're really over time. I'm thanking everybody for the interest, because we received many questions, but in the sake of time, we won't be able to answer orally them all right here, right now. Please reach out to Nina in the chat function, and she will direct it to the relevant speakers. I'm confident that all questions will be responded. So we should conclude our session, and getting back to the takeaways, takeaway messages. I'd like to propose 3 messages. Discrimination and crackdown on key populations is coming back stronger in COVID-19 times, and taking unprecedented dimensions, directly risking civil society's ability to support those most at risk of HIV. In addition to the findings of the Civicus and Peach report on structural and persistent violations, we heard fresh examples on how COVID-19 is utilized as an excuse to attack the human rights of key populations around the world. Such attacks on communities that are at the forefront of the public health response and detrimental to both ending AIDS and containing COVID-19. Therefore, business as usual is not an option. As highlighted by Maria and Kate, COVID-19 also provides opportunities. The huge mobilization of resources for the global response to COVID-19 from all major donors and financiers, such as the Global Fund, is a great show of leadership and solidarity. Civil society involvement with the ACT accelerator and collaboration between various constituencies on one hand, and between them and the major multilateral agencies leading the COVID-19 response is also one very positive example. Such solidarity, collaboration, and joining up of efforts is the way forward to fight back and make the biggest impact on people's lives. And finally, at the policy level, the development of the new Global Fund and UNAIDS strategies also presents important opportunities to protect the civic space for communities and key populations. It's really great to hear that Global Fund and Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs commitment to do more and better in protecting civil society engagement and human rights. I think you should let us as a communities and donors engage seriously with these processes to ensure that the money follows. So with this, I need to wrap up by thanking to all the speakers and the participants. I want to thank all the organizations, Global Fund Advocates Network, the Global Fund itself, Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Peach Partners, Frontline AIDS and AIDS Funds, Civicus. Thank for your interest and the many questions. I also reminding you that the report and the video is available on the websites of AIDS Funds and Frontline AIDS and Civicus for full report, and it's also launched in Twitter. So again, many thanks to everybody, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Anton. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. I will leave the chat open for a few moments if anyone has any questions that they'd like to put in, but I'm going to stop the recording of the call now.
Hi, everyone.